Hello everybody, my name's Tim Hughes. I'm the Director of Communications for Spirit Invest. Today I'm going to interview again the Managing Director of Warwick Wealth Managers, Marc Wiese. The general theme we're going to talk about today is international diversification and OWM's approach to this. Hello, Marc.
Hi, Tim.
Good to see you again. I've got a few
much.
questions that have been raised over time with respect to international diversification. So why, in the first instance, why do you place and why does the company and the group place so much emphasis on international diversification?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for dialing in. I think it's been a fairly topical item in South Africa over the past maybe 5, 10 or 15 years. But ultimately, I think what you need to look at is the overall size of the South African economy and stock market compared to the world economy and stock market. Now, if you look into the stats in a bit more depth, you can see that South Africa makes up less than 0.5% of the world GDP and about 0.6% of the global stock market. Now, that's a significantly small portion. And I think a lot of South Africans over the years have been indoctrinated that you need to invest locally. And that probably comes all the way from the apartheid years where clients and investors were forced to invest in South Africa. Those metrics have been, I suppose, relaxed to some extent. And South African citizens do have the opportunity now to invest a lot larger portions of their wealth in the international economy.
Yeah, indeed so. But a critical question I think many investors think about is how does the Rand play into this? How does that configure into your thinking with respect to international diversification?
Well, I mean, ultimately, if you're staying in South Africa, you're still spending rands. So to have a rand exposure in your portfolio still remains pretty important. But ultimately, a lot of the goods that we use in South Africa are imported, which means the dollar and international currency certainly have a big impact. If the rand devalues, although you're living in rands and you're buying goods from outside of South Africa, having a rand diversified portfolio into dollars or other currencies, I believe still remains a pretty important factor. If you look at the trend over the longer term, the rand generally has devalued against most global major currencies. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think the risks within South Africa is ultimately one of them, but also coupled with the fact that our inflation rate in South Africa over prolonged periods has been higher than most of the first world economies. And if you've got a high inflation rate, generally your currency devalues.
Yeah, good points. What about in terms of South Africa, the different sectors in which we can invest? Can't we get enough variety of the sectors here at home?
I mean, I've mentioned, I think there are quite a few reasons why international diversification remains pretty important. But I think one of the biggest ones is for long-term growth of your portfolio. Now, the simple reality is the South African stock market is still pretty dominated by some industrial stocks and some mining stocks. We don't really have a lot of the new age technologies, things like biotech, AI, electric motor vehicles, things of the future as listed stocks in South Africa. So to have exposure to those type of companies that we expect will provide clients with long-term substantial growth, to have an element of your investment portfolio allocated to international assets still remains pretty important.
Yeah, indeed. I think you're touching on something that investors have a concern about as well in South Africa, and that's the risk perspective. Can you just touch on the risk perspective also as we look at international diversification? How does risk factor into this?
Well, once again, I mean, we live in South Africa, this is our country, and it's a beautiful country, and we want to stay here. But I think we're blind of us to not realize the risks that are unfortunately prevalent in the country. This includes quite a few different risks, but ultimately political risks, as we've seen over the past couple of years, has remained a big issue. And it's caused a lot of volatility in both our stock markets as well as our currency. I think we've got a lot of event risk in South Africa around how the country operates, as well as the international community views us, including the likes of more recently the grey listing. So ultimately, South Africa as an investment destination is certainly more risky than a lot of the first world counterparts. And that's why South African investors do get a premium in terms of our fixed income allocations. But in terms of global equities, I think it's still a pretty risky place to be focused only on South Africa.
Like finally, Marc, you've touched on this, but we have this idea that, local is lekker, but some investors just feel safer investing in South Africa in things and companies and areas in which they're familiar with. So how do you address that with respect to local investors and international diversification?
Well, when we approach a client, I think it's important to look at the holistic picture of each client. And most clients, if you look at the total net worth, they probably own a property in South Africa, which is usually a large percentage of their overall assets they own. Generally own vehicles in South Africa, which could be a large percentage. They generally also have a retirement annuity or pension fund, which is restricted by Regulation 28 that you have to invest at least 65% of your assets in South Africa. So if you look at the entire picture, in terms of discretionary monies as well as the overall offshore allocation of your retirement assets, we do tend to take a offshore slant, quite simply just to ensure that when you look at the total net worth of a client, that they are well diversified offshore, not only as a percentage of the underlying investment, but as the total net worth.
Mark, that's great. That's a great synopsis in terms of your approach, OWM's approach to international diversification. We'll be posting the video on the YouTube channel as usual, and there's a whole series of interviews with Mark, and we'll look at a topic in future to add to this portfolio of YouTube presentations by Orion Wealth Managers. Thank you for viewing.